Hello, and welcome to Daddy Daughter Scary Horror Bonus Episode 1. Let's talk violence, folks. I am William H. Bradford III, and I believe this is the end of my contractual obligation.
Not sure how I feel about that theme song or intro, but okay. So in violence, we forget who we are. That was Mary McCarthy, American author, who said that. And I like that quote because it's true. When we get violent, we lose the civilized part of ourselves. So that's one way of interpreting that. But in violence, we forget who we are. We can get lost in the fantasy of violence, too.
Yeah.
And it is really difficult. And this is what we're here to talk about today in our first bonus episode. Talking about the monstrous, like we're doing with this podcast, it's impossible to ignore or sidestep violence, especially not in the artistic medium of film. And as we mentioned during our 13 Ghosts remake intro, you can step all the way back philosophically and address violence in art, and graphic violence was depicted in traditional art back in the 1500s. And violence and monsters in art often represented societal unrest, and they made important political statements. And good horror movies follow in that tradition, as we're going to see. So, Serling, what do you count as art? What do you think about when we say art?
Like, do you mean like the media of it?
Yeah,
Like
anything. Like what flashes into your mind when you think of just the word art?
Like, I've seen pictures with like that were painted on like bark. Which
Yeah, like art goes all the way back to caveman walls. Yeah, so there's art, painted and drawn. Music is art. Poetry is art. Pottery is art.
Oh yeah, pottery.
Yeah.
Painting.
Sculpture.
Arts.
We're getting overly philosophical, perhaps. But
walls.
Here's another question. Does something have to be beautiful to be considered art?
No. No, not at all.
Huh? Okay, so follow that thought. What are we talking about?
It depends on the person, because people can have their own opinion of art.
Yeah.
I know that there's like violent pictures of art that some people are disturbed or upset by.
Yeah, a lot of people might say that something can be considered art as long as it inspires a definite internal reaction in you.
Oh, yes.
And that could mean anything on the emotional scales. So, like, if we're being generous enough to say that anything creative can qualify as art, then film, and by the same argument, obviously, films of the horror variety should have the opportunity to qualify as art, right?
Yeah. So if a movie creates an internal response, positive or negative, then bingo, perhaps?
Yeah, maybe it's a bingo. Why not? I mean, the worst way to describe a movie for me might be boring.
So the worst thing that art can do to you is nothing?
Maybe, yeah. What do you think of that?
Well, it's kind of the same for me.
Yeah, so film, including horror films, as we said, reflect what's going on historically, culturally, societally, just like traditional artists have done for hundreds of years.
Godzilla calls out nuclear war.
Yes, and created a giant scaly metaphor to represent the nightmares created in the aftermath of America dropping 2 atomic bombs to effectively end World War II. And the original movie is truly devastating art.
Gojira.
Yeah, 1956. Gojira, released in Japan and then released as Godzilla when it came out in America. Do you know what 2 animals they mixed together in the Japanese language to get Gojira, Serling? Whale and gorilla.
Oh, whale and gorilla?
Yep.
Right.
I was the only one able to answer that question at Trivia Night a few years ago at the Surly Goat here in Encino. Trivia Night at bars, by the way, not much fun.
More nuclear nervousness followed with mutated monster films like Tarantula and The Amazing Colossal Man. It came from beneath the sea, giant octopus, and them, giant ants.
Yes, large ants. And America's growing fear of Russia and communism came out in movies like It Came from Outer Space, Thing from Another World, and Invasion of the Body Snatchers, even though Don Finley, the author, never intended his work to reflect the kind of the Red Scare of the Cold War that was going on. So fear becomes very politicized in the films of the 1950s.
Environmentalism merges with horror in the 70s. Our first film that we're covering on the pod in this genre is Alligator Shot in 1979. But you've also got Piranha Orca, starring Dumbledore or Richard Harris.
Yes.
And there's Food of the Gods.
Yes, which is very, very loosely based on an H.G. Wells novel. Yeah, not just giant rats. There's a bunch of giant animals in that one.
Yeah.
And then you've also got...
There's a poster in the studio that we're recording in.
Oh yeah, we can put that we can put that up on our ddshpod.com.
Check it out.
Website.
It's really cool.
Check that out. Yeah, in the 70s you've also got Prophecy and Grizzly, so you got mutated and regular bears as part of this environmentalism horror smash up. You got Frogs.
Squirm?
Yes, the worms, yeah. Kingdom of the Spiders with the always great Bill Shatner. You got The Swarm. You got Willard.
Yay, Willard. Rats, I'm guessing. Giant rats.
Giant rat? Oh, no, just regular rats.
Oh. Animals seem to have got pretty busy during the 70s.
Yeah, late 70s. And into the 80s, horror starts penetrating traditional cozy suburbia.
Before that, characters in movies had to go off to some remote location, a crumbling castle, a spooky island, a stark motel off the main highway, abandoned farmhouse, a rustic cabin, or just somewhere off the beaten track to encounter something hidden, secret, or horrifying.
Yes, but then the monsters started coming into your neighborhoods and knocking on your front doors. We started feeling less and less protected by what traditionally offered us comfort. And beyond the 80s, we start getting American horror films that reflected how other nations were feeling about us and our politics, which may not have always been super great.
The point is that art and horror movies twist, dance, and evolve to hold a mirror up to what's going on around us and raise our consciousness through raising our anxiety about those issues.
Yes, and the violence in these movies helps to raise that anxiety and provoke a reaction, which is another purpose of art, and extreme gestures in art. But how extreme should these gestures be?
Well, that's the tricky part, because it's different for everyone.
Yeah, this is what you were saying before. We all have different trigger sensitivities for our reaction points, and the motion picture industry developed a rating system in the late 60s. This is what we all know. So we have G for the kid movies, general audience, all the way through PG and R, and X for very adult material and ultra violence, and of course boobs. And 1984 was a big year for this rating system.
Yeah, because two films came out that caused a lot of public outcry because they were too violent for the PG rating that they were given. So that's when PG-13 came into play.
Yeah. Do you know what those movies were?
No.
You've seen one of them.
Have I?
One of the movies was Gremlins.
Gremlins?
And the other movie was Indiana Jones. The second Indiana Jones. I'm blanking on the title now.
Is it with that, weird girl?
Yeah. Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. It was very dark. And, parents were like, these movies are not PG. These go a little further than PG. So this was the force behind adding PG-13. I think actually, as we see, 13 seems to kind of be a dividing line for us in recommending an age for kids to be able to watch a lot of these movies that we're talking about. So I'm in favor of the PG-13 rating. But before even all this, there was a censoring system for motion pictures called the Hays Code. And this was suggested by religious representatives in the late 1920s who were concerned about these talking movies that were coming out and how they might be negatively impacting children. So basically film studios had to monitor their product to avoid the, quote, lowering of society's moral standards, unquote.
That's pretty vague.
It is. But it was certainly meant to limit the amount and intensity of violence projected onto the big screen. And we could devote a whole episode to the Hays Coast, but honestly, who on earth would listen to that? Serling, so when does violence work for you when you're watching a scary movie? When are you like, yeah, I dig this?
I think when it can build up tension, then you're like, oh my God. Because you've tested me on that, and you've said, like, all right, and we'll continue the rest tomorrow. And I would say, no, we have to continue.
I know. So violence works for you when it kind of amps up the tension of the story. Like, can you think of movies where it's really worked for you, the violence in it?
Yes. There's Predator, there's Alien, there's Psycho, which is in black and white, though.
Yeah, just because it's in black and white doesn't mean it's any less violent than something that's shot in Technicolor.
Yeah, true.
Yeah, for me, like, violence works when a character is set up for you to really despise them. And when they get theirs and then some. I like that. And we haven't really seen that yet.
You do.
The lawyer in the 13 Ghosts remake came close, but I think the filmmakers were, to my taste, they were just a step or two away from making him truly deserving of the awesome, amazing death he got. But, like, Burke in Aliens.
Oh, yeah.
There is a truly odious character. You know what odious means?
No.
Disgusting and bad.
Oh.
And you don't even see his death. A little violence laid out on him would have been welcome. Although not seeing the violence sometimes allows us to fill in the blanks. And do you like that at all? Like when you don't see the violence and you let your imagination kind of run wild?
Well, yes and no. Because sometimes it can, like, do that right in the middle of a good scene. And then you're like, oh, wait. Oh, you don't get to see it. Oh.
Would you rather see the violence or imagine the violence?
I like that you can make your brain imagine it. Mm-hmm. Like at the end of Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, where he takes off with Dracula, the Wolfman and Dracula.
Yeah.
They just jump off, and you're like,
wait,
what happened to them?
You don't see them smashing into the rocks.
Did they die, or did they just get washed away by the currents?
Did they land gently in the tide?
With spiky rocks.
In each other's loving embrace.
Dad, no!
Oh, I was watching a different movie.
Huh?
But no, that's an interesting question. Like, how much violence do you want to see, and how much violence do you want to imagine?
Oh, about 100%.
So when doesn't violence work for you? When are you like, this is taking away from the experience of the movie for me? And I know we probably share at least some of the same opinion here.
I hate, and I think I know a lot of people listening or watching this on, like, YouTube probably hate animal cruelty too, because I just feel so bad for them. They didn't do anything wrong.
Yeah, and there's a lot of that in horror movies. It's kind of a trope. And one of my favorite directors uses that trope quite a bit. So why do you think there's so much animal violence in horror movies? I know it bothers both of us, and there's a lot of it. Why do you think that?
To make you hate the creature or killer.
Yeah, the monster. I think it's to play on our heartstrings. It's the kind of a way to incrementally get us to root against the villain.
Then you're like, oh, this guy deserves to die. But then when it dies, or maybe it doesn't, you can be like, oh, wait, it was just hungry. It just needed to eat.
And usually we see a dead animal before we see a dead person in a horror movie.
Yes.
But to me, killing off a dog is worse than killing off, the first kill of what's typically like a poorly written or annoying character. So is some degree of violence necessary, in your opinion, to tell a scary story?
Yes.
Okay.
I've written stories that I haven't shown.
I know. So what do you use the violence for in the stories that you write?
Tension.
Okay. I think that for kids, getting to a point where they're watching violence in television and movies it's a way for them to feel more adult and more connected to a world that's outside maybe the protected safety of childhood. Does it feel kind of like a rite of passage for you in a way? Like You're testing the boundaries by experimenting with how much of what adults watch you can handle?
Maybe.
I think that is kind of part of growing up.
I don't really know.
Like, I grew up in the 80s. I remember there were books in our middle school library that detailed makeup and special effects of the 1970s films like The Exorcist and Taxi Driver. So I came to know who Dick Smith was. Dick Smith was a very famous makeup guy. And I came to know who Arthur Penn and Sam Peckinpah were. Sam Peckinpah also, thanks to Monty Python for that education. So I always had a fascination with how violence was filmed and what tricks they used to create the violence. And this was around the time when we got cable when I was a kid, and I started consuming the 1980s slasher flicks of that time.
Lad.
I was your age. I was 10. I was like 10, 11 years old, same as you. And I found violence more troubling in realistic films that were well made and well shot, like The Godfather and movies like that. Horror is the realm of fantasy, and I think my mind just kind of automatically puts horror film violence in that category. It's easier for me to kind of dismiss it as not real. But how does violence impact you when you see it in scary movies? Because I know there have been moments that we've watched some violence going down in a movie, and you've been like, wow, how did they do that, right?
Yeah, like an Alien.
And Tremors, I think that was that was an early movie where you're like, how did they do that? And then there have also been a couple of times,
Jaws.
No spoilers, where you were genuinely freaked out, right? And where Daddy may have been pushing a little too far with what he thought you could handle. I think there were like 2 or 3 times that happened. But the point is also that I was right alongside you. And we hit stop when we needed to, and we continued only when you really wanted to, which was most of the time. And interestingly enough, talking about violence, for all that you've seen, the only nightmares that you've ever really had were related to things
silly
that you've seen on TV, but that have been completely unrelated to horror movies, right?
Yeah.
Unless you count Slimer from Ghostbusters, which I don't really count that as horror. He terrified you.
No, he didn't.
Probably because of all the cholesterol of those hot dogs he was eating.
Well,
I think you were worried about, I think you had nightmares about his doctor bills, even though he's dead. But, I was attracted to violence and gore in movies at an early age. I'm not at all a violent person, unless technology in the house starts rebelling against me. But do you think watching violence in movies increases somebody's tendency to be violent in real life?
Depends on the person.
Yeah. I think that's probably fair to say.
Insane.
But you know what the research suggests? There is no link. And it's been studied a lot. There's been a lot of research between violence in films or violence in video games and whether or not it causes violence in real life. And there's no evidence of that. In fact, some studies have even found that violence in horror movies reduces anxiety and may actually prevent violence rather than inspiring it.
How so?
I think you see violence and it can be this sort of tension release and this catharsis. And it's fun. It's like a roller coaster ride, and you're exploring these monstrous, threatening scenarios, but in a way that feels really safe because you're on your couch and you're watching it on a TV, and sometimes it feels real, but you always have that comfort of separation of knowing, okay, this is a movie, and this is something I'm watching, and this is something I'm watching with my parent. Yeah. So do you ever feel like seeing violence in a movie, stress decreases for you afterwards?
Oh, gosh. Maybe?
Because sometimes you see something violent and you laugh.
Oh, yeah.
Or you're like, oh, my God, that was so cool. Let's watch that again.
Yeah.
So that's like a positive release of energy. And that's kind of like anxiety release.
Yeah, I guess.
All right, good. You've proven my point. No further questions, Your Honor. Well, this was interesting. This was fun to kind of have this
yes, it was.
Conversation with you. First of several. Maybe we'll have other bonus episodes where we go a little deeper. Maybe we'll talk about what kind of people like horror movies. I know there are a lot of people who were inspired by a lot of the films that you're going to be watching for the first time on this podcast and went on to now make scary movies. People like Guillermo del Toro.
Yay.
who get totally energized and inspired by watching scary movies as a kid, and they grow up to want to make that their career and their life. And it's a really interesting topic of conversation at the very least. So we'll keep talking about it here. Meanwhile, check us out on ddshpod.com. Oh, this music again. Check us out on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. And we're about to post Alligator from 1980. It's the last movie we watched. And we will see you soon.
Please like and subscribe. Have an amazing day. Enjoy yourself. Peace.